Good morning, all of your colleagues who have arrived today to learn and join together in a discussion of restorative justice. We have a few more people entering from the wait room. We'll allow just a moment. For those of you who are just arriving, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. Tell us where you're at. Say good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are.
60700 is what we started at.
Well, if we were at a real conference, I would invite you to take your seats, but let's go ahead and begin. Just a warm welcome to the second day of the Harm, Healing, and Human Dignity, an all Catholic conference on restorative justice. My name is Sean Horrigan, and I'm from the University of San Diego's Center for Restorative Justice and a member of the conference planning team. Just a special welcome to those of you who are joining us for the first time today. And we have an exciting day with some excellent speakers and sessions planned. Just a few housekeeping items before we begin. Please continue to introduce yourself in the chat. We invite you to breathe and take stretch breaks as needed so that you can stay grounded and stay with us as we move through today's content. As we arrive, we want to invite you to take a look at the graphic recordings from Tuesday's plenary talks. You'll find those located on the website, and we'll see a link in the chat box to help take you to that, or you'll see it on the screen as well. A little later in today's opening plenary, you will need a piece of paper and something to write with for an activity that we have planned. Also want to invite you to pin Drew. He is our graphic organizer and will be sharing some content throughout today's plenary. There's also Spanish language interpretation, and you can see the chat for instructions on how to access that. Please feel free to change your name using those three little dashes in the upper right-hand corner of your video. Let us know however you'd like to be referred to. And then finally, be mindful of muting and unmuting, and please, we ask that you kindly not share the Zoom links outside of registered conference participants. So on behalf of the conference planning team, let me just offer a word on self-care and triggers. RJ is a lot about harm, which means this conference is presenting stories of harm and how people use restorative justice to heal from it. These stories may bring up strong feelings within you, and I encourage you to anticipate known triggers and engage in self-care. Firstly, ensure that you're in touch with a professional if it's appropriate for your circumstances. And if you need to rescue yourself from any of the material presented throughout the conference, please do so and reach out to the conference planning team to let us know if you need special access to the content and session resources in some other way. Additionally, please take breaks, meditate, connect with your support system, and reach out to your colleagues as needed. Please, please prioritize your own well-being during this conference. We also want to take a moment and thank all of our wonderful and amazing conference sponsors who helped make this possible. A special thanks to Ascension for their sponsorship today. Now I want to pass it off to Caitlin to take us through our next part of the plenary.
Thank you so much, Sean. Hello and welcome. Again, we're so glad to be back with you. We hope you had a good Wednesday. So in addition to restorative approaches, aligning with Catholic social tradition that we've been talking about throughout this conference. Sujatha Baliga reminded us on Tuesday afternoon of how restorative approaches are also closely aligned and connected with Indigenous tradition. And in a particular way, we've heard about how circle process is rooted in Native American peacemaking circles. For some nations, this approach to community and conflict has been a way of life for generations, which is demonstrated in models such as Navajo peacemaking courts. So some of us may also be aware that the relationship between the Catholic Church's institutions and Native peoples here in the United States is complex, with its own history of harm and needs for healing. So joining me today in dialogue to shed light on this critical area of understanding are Maka Knajin Black Elk, who is Executive Director of the Truth and Healing work at Red Cloud Indian School, and Deacon Andy Orozco, who serves the Diocese of San Bernardino. So thank you so much and welcome to you both.
Thank you, Caitlin, for having us.
So first, I wonder if you could each just tell us a little bit about yourselves and your role in Native American Catholic relations. And Deacon Andy, would you like to begin?
Sure. Hauka, hello and blessings to all. Again, I am Deacon Andy Orozco, who serves my Native American people and all people within my diocese, officially through the Native American ministry in the Diocese of San Bernardino. And in an official capacity, nationally by invitations like this one, to give one voice from many who do not share the same opportunity given to me to voice their thoughts or concerns with the church, with the community, or the nation. I'm here to bring awareness to the beauty of the Native American culture and traditions of the indigenous peoples of this land for over 10,000 years, and to put a human face on the invisible. I'm here to promote the embracing of historical sins, to bind the wounds of these sins, and finally heal so that we may all live in a peace-filled heart. Restorative justice calls for the healing of all people, those who were the perpetrators, those who were the victims, including all who were affected, the families on both sides, the community, and those who serve the community. I want to thank each and every one of you for allowing me to dialogue with you openly this morning. Maka?
Thank you, Deacon Andy. As was mentioned, my name is Maka Knajin Black Elk. I am the Executive Director for Truth and Healing at Red Cloud Indian School, which is a K-12 Jesuit school in Pine Ridge, South Dakota on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. In my role and in my work, I started off as an educator with our students working with our young people in our high school, but really my work has always kind of been focused on how we understand ourselves as Indigenous peoples and what that means for our future and our relationships, I think, by and large. So in this current role, Red Cloud Indian School is a former Indian boarding school. And for those who are not aware, Indian boarding schools have a very dark history of sort of pernicious cultural genocide. And so that is true of our history as well. And it's something that our community still broadly feels and understands and experiences in different ways, especially the aftermath and the long-lasting effects of historical trauma. So my work is really about addressing that and facing that in our community for the first time in a way that's intentional, because in order to really recover, we have to face the pain and the hurt that has been impacted. So that is what I do and what I'll be doing for some time now.
Thank you both so much. So you've each made reference to this history and also how it impacts our present. And so can you talk a little bit about what harms and needs are important for this conference community to understand?
Yes, I'll go ahead and start. Well, since the fall of man, the beginning of creation, there have been tragic tragic stories of peoples imposing their will on others, and it hasn't stopped. It continues to this day. For the Native American people, specifically for my region, we have the mission system, where we had the Spanish come and impose their way of life without looking into who we are as a people, since we had been in this land for over 10,000 years, and imposing their laws, their ways, and basically taking away our livelihood as Native people, taking away our culture, taking away our language. Though it may have been in their eyes a good thing for us as a Native people, specifically for our area, there was a lot of loss of culture, a lot of loss of tradition, a lot of loss of language. Those things that are important. If those of you who have, well, we all have a cultural background. We all have a place where our ancestors originated from, whether it's Italian or French or whatever. But just imagine losing your Italian language or your French language or those other languages that show who you are as a people. Well, that's what happened to us. It's a complex subject. There's a lot of deep hurts. This last year in 2019, there was the 250th commemoration of the founding of Mission San Diego de Acala, the first mission in California. And with that, it was both a difficult time and also a good time, because it allowed us to be able to finally have a voice at the table. And I think that is what we're all seeking is to have a voice at the table, so that way we can start healing, we can start being one with each other, and in a good way. Makah?
Thank you, Deacon Andy. I would just echo, I think a lot of the historical pieces that Deacon Andy described are also true of my community as well, in terms of just the specifics of historical harm and the damage to cultural practice, languages, etc. But I think it's also important to understand the long-term impact of that particular, I think, that set of actions and sort of the broad consequences that still linger today. I think for a lot of Indigenous peoples, there is still a strong need for discernment about who we are as Indigenous peoples. So much of the dialogue around Indigenous peoples today has this very challenging question about our status and our sense of belonging. Are we these separate nations, or are we, sort of integrated into the society? And to what extent are either of those things true? And I tend to refer to this sort of outcome that's come about as this sort of false binary, that Indigenous peoples are faced with this choice. That's a false choice, but nonetheless, it's a choice that's sort of presented often, where we have to choose either empowering our traditions, our language, our culture, and sort of trying to be true to those or return to those, or in lieu of that we're choosing, some Westernization, and that these two things are fundamentally incompatible. So we have these really difficult conversations that need to happen around our unique place in American society, and questions about what we want for our future as communities through healing from those historic wounds. And that's a conversation that I think doesn't exclude our non-Indigenous communities either, because they have a role to play, I think, in asking that same question to themselves of what does it mean for our Indigenous communities to belong to this nation, or to have the sort of self-determination that has been recognized, and to what extent are those things incompatible or not? And I think the answer is that they're not, but we're not in a place to fully understand that yet, and communities really have to have these difficult conversations through this work.
Amazing. Thank you. And so to wrap us up in what I know is such a much wider conversation, but we will ask, especially in light of your faith, what does the work of healing and reconciliation look like for you? What role might restorative justice approaches play in that process for your communities?
Well, we are all spiritual people. And this differs from religious because we're speaking in terms of the creature and its relationship to the other creatures and creation. When we are connected in relationship with each other, we're at peace, and there isn't the chaos and imbalance. There's different levels of this spirituality, the personal, the family, the community, the world, and universe, and all affects the other. And yes, the personal can affect the universe just as much as the universe can affect the person. What is also important to understand is that God, our Creator, God the Father, is present in only that brings us closer to Him spiritually, and through a deeper relationship through Him, because of our deeper relationship with each other. In the Lord's Prayer, Jesus prays, "Your kingdom will come when your will is done on earth as it is in heaven." And in heaven, there is only peace, never chaos. Restorative justice, practiced in a way that embraces true healing and forgiveness by all, allows us to heal in a loving way, a way that wills the heavenly good of another before self. It is a complete circle, where we help heal each other, so that we can live as one with each other.
Thank you, Deacon Andy. I agree, and I think I'm sometimes asked the question quite explicitly: how can you be a Native person and Catholic? And I think it's a reasonable question given the violent history that the Catholic Church played a role in terms of the colonization of the Americas. And so it's an understandable question, one that I think as a part of our healing process, we actually have to take it seriously. I don't think we've taken that question seriously and give it a serious investigation, answering the difficult challenges that poses, and face the history full on in order to, I think, move forward and recover, because that is, I think, what's part of the gap, is this sort of we're still grappling with trying to understand how that history plays out today and what role it has in our ability to look to Christ and see His universal message, while understanding that we are all sinners as well, and finding not only the forgiveness, but I think the personal understanding of that complicated history, and making it something that we can fully see ourselves as sort of fully human, because the unfortunate outcome of this history was an element of dehumanization, right? And so there's certainly a gap in understanding oneself as fully human, as that spiritual body, and I think that's part of the healing process, is getting to that point again.
Thank you both so much for these tremendous reflections and stories. And I know that they will be expanded upon in the workshop on historical harms on Saturday. And there is a prayer that you two have collaborated to create for us this morning, bring us through, invite us into. Is there anything that you'd like to share about the prayer before we enter into it together?
Sure. I would just offer that, we asked Indigenous Catholic people across the nation to just contribute short portions of a prayer, just as a way to sort of allow all of us here gathering together to think about, the different Indigenous peoples across this country, to think about the Indigenous peoples who are in the place where you live, and to just be mindful of all of the gifts that we bring.
Thank you.
We thank you, O Lord, for in your loving wisdom, you created one human family with the diversity that enriches our communities.
Haishi, Inima, Wik, Sarakiti, Tu, Onisema, Ishtahake, Sikpuan, Ink, Shik, Itan, Wik, Tilianak, Ink, Mash, Inimash, Wink, Shtamari.
We pray to you, Amna, O Lord, that we may affirm each person's dignity through fair access for all, that no one be denied for who they are, that each life be held sacred.
Buju and Dinawe Magani Duk, Jawanuekwe Indigena Kaz, Ogishki Manasi Nindudem, Gazagaskwa Jumeka Kintunchaba, Gakabi Kanginda. We pray to you, Gijemani Du, for the indigenous peoples of what is now called the United States, that we too find justice and peace to heal the wounds of the past, that we hold hope in your light.
We thank you, O Lord, for your call and challenge to us, that we may reveal your teachings and your love through our actions to end racism and to proclaim that we are all your children, heirs to your sacred creation. Amen.
We thank you, O Lord, for in your loving.
Thank you very much. As we continue into our next activity and move into our next speakers, I want to invite you to have a piece of paper and something to write with in front of you. Anything to write on will be sufficient. Even the back of some note paper will be just fine. Today, we want to engage in what's called a spiral journal. And in that journal, we'd ask you to make two lines, a vertical line and a horizontal line. And what we're going to ask you to do is to take your writing utensil, starting in the center, and to just draw a spiral, a tight, slow spiral around those four quadrants. Focus on the spiral. Bring your attention to that spiral as you draw a single spiral circle. And when I say stop, I'll ask you to stop your pen or your pencil in the quadrant. Go ahead and stop. And in the quadrant where your spiral stopped, we're going to ask you to make a few reflections. So in that quadrant, please reflect on the prompt, right now I feel. Access your feelings, where you are right now. And moving clockwise to the next quadrant. Reflect on something that's been on your mind. What are you holding in your head? What takes up your attention? And continuing clockwise to the third quadrant. Reflect on a big challenge or question that you're bringing to this gathering. What is moving you forward and motivating you to seek and to be curious about? And in the final quadrant, the fourth one, something that you hope to give or receive from this virtual community. What is something that you hope to give or receive in this virtual community? Now, with all of that reflection in mind, although quick, take that reflection and in the chat box, would you offer this community to a little bit of insight on what do you want to be different after this conference? Share that in the chat box for us. What is something that you want to be different when this conference is over? And as those chats come in about what people want to be different after this conference, please see what your colleagues, your fellow conference participants are sharing. What can you borrow? What can you align with? What can we support together? Thank you. Please allow those to keep coming. And I want to transition now to Chris Ann to introduce our next plenary speaker.
Thank you, Sean. And thank you, Maka, Deacon Andy, and Caitlin. What a powerful way to get started today. And I am grateful for how each of you has called us into this space and invited us to bring our whole selves into this experience. Thank you. I have the distinct pleasure of introducing the next two extraordinary restorative justice thought leaders, Howard Zehr and Danielle Sered. Howard Zehr is widely known as the grandfather of restorative justice and a pioneer in the modern concept. Howard is Mennonite and began as a practitioner and theorist in restorative justice in the late 1970s. 30 years ago, he wrote a seminal text called Changing Lenses, Restorative Justice for Our Times, offering a framework for understanding crime, injury, accountability, and healing from a restorative perspective. It looks at our assumptions about crime, the courts, retributive justice, and the legal process, while offering alternatives for public policy and judicial reform. Today, decades since Changing Lenses was originally published, it remains the classic text of the restorative justice field. This text and its companion, the Little Book of Restorative Justice, are worth considering for your personal library. Howard Zehr was an early advocate of making the needs of victims central to responses to harm, and has anchored the theme of his life's work in respecting the dignity of all peoples. He emphasizes restorative justice's alignment with biblical justice. And to this day, Howard is a steadfast advocate for emerging leaders in the restorative justice field. Howard couldn't be with us live today, so he prepared a recorded remark. Our second speaker is Danielle Sered. Danielle leads the Brooklyn-based organization called Common Justice, operating the first alternative to incarceration and victim service program in the United States that focuses on violent felonies in adult courts. Common Justice is a critical actor at the national level, leveraging the lessons of its direct service to transform the justice system more broadly. Danielle Sered has been at the forefront of advancing practical and groundbreaking solutions to violence that advance racial equity and meet the needs of those harmed without relying on incarceration. She is also a prolific writer, and her latest book is entitled Until We Reckon: Violence, Mass Incarceration, and a Road to Repair. I would highly recommend it. In her book, Danielle leads us through a compelling reckoning with the stories we tell ourselves about violence. She writes, displacing old stories needs replacing with new stories, ones that include wounds, rage, loss, sorrow, hope. Stories that include the context in which violence takes place, not as an excuse, but as a piece of the puzzle of ending it. Stories that hold everyone accountable for harm, both the individuals who commit it and the societies that allow it. Stories with both a before and after. It's such a powerful read. Danielle has been featured widely in the public conversation about mass incarceration and violence, including the Aspen Ideas Festival, the Atlantic Magazine Summit on Race and Justice, in the Washington Post. I could go on. Both are exceptional speakers. It is my joy to honor and welcome the wisdom of Howard Zehr and Danielle Sered into our dialogue today. Take a look at the video from Howard.
Good afternoon, or good morning, depending where you are. I'd like to bring you greetings from the Center for Justice and Peace Building at Eastern Mennonite University in Harrisonburg, Virginia, where I'm still connected. I'm really honored to do the warm-up act for my friend Danielle. You know, you really couldn't do better for a speaker for this topic. You're lucky you got her. I know she doesn't do too many of these things these days. I've been asked to reflect a little bit on my interactions with the Catholic community during the early days of restorative justice. But let me give you a little background. I believe that restorative justice has many roots going back to many traditions over many years. In many ways, it's a synthesis of a variety of things. But it has a specific start as a field in the 1970s in a particular practice that was then called Victim Offender Reconciliation Program, sometimes called Victim Offender Conferencing today. It was designed to address some particular deficiencies in the criminal legal system. Of course, since that time, it's spread to many different applications and different practice models, but that's kind of where it started. In those days, we didn't have an overall philosophy or concept, and there was no term other than VORP, Victim Offender Reconciliation Program, for it. But in the early 80s, I began to pull together some of the arguments and the strains, the threads that eventually I published in my book, Changing Lenses, that provided foundations, as I saw it, for restorative justice. The Catholic community was part of both of these developments. For one thing, various Catholic communities ran early programs. I particularly remember the Diocese of Oakland, which developed and operated some pioneering programs. But also, they were engaged in the original development of the concept. In the early 80s, when I was working on these things, I was asked to be the speaker for a national conference of priests and nuns doing prison ministry. And that's the first time that over several days, I rolled out the arguments that eventually became the basis for my book, Changing Lenses, and got the feedback. Later, I did the same thing for some other groups like Diocese of Boston and so forth. And then since that, after those years, I had many engagements with the Catholic community around both the practices and the concept of the philosophy of. Today, restorative justice has spread, as you know, to many different areas of application, and it's in most of the world. In addition to the variety of practice models, which range from victim offender conferencing to circle processes, what is really important to me is that it's also a framework, a conceptual framework, a set of principles and practices that we bring to situations, regardless of whether there's a program available. In fact, some argue we bring it to life itself. And basically, it provides a kind of vision of how we want to live together. It's a relational approach to not only justice, but to life. one that emphasizes values such as respect and responsibility in relationship. In addition to my work in restorative justice, or maybe as part of that, in the mid-1980s, I chaired the National Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty. During those years, Tony Anaya was governor of New Mexico, a devout Catholic. He was leaving office and he was considering commuting the death sentences in New Mexico. His advisors were saying that's not a good idea politically. Someone came up, a friend came, an activist came up with the idea that I should go try to get an audience with Pope John Paul II. The leadership, Catholic leadership in the US said, probably not going to happen. But I took it as a challenge and I worked on that. And sure enough, in 1985, I received an invitation to meet with Pope John Paul II during his one of his meditations that he does in the square there. So my wife and I flew to Rome and we met with the Pope. There's a picture of the event that my wife says, I look like I'm trying to sell him a used car. And maybe it felt that way. That was a mostly ceremonial meeting, but then we met with his lawyers. Eventually, he declined to engage, saying that he couldn't interfere in the business of another country, but he soon began to do that. So my wife thinks maybe we softened him up a little bit. I don't know. But both the death penalty abolition movement and the restorative justice movement have come a long way since those days. I'm really energized with how restorative justice has been applied to so many different situations that I never envisioned. I'm really pleased with how it has been incorporated and adapted and changed by a new generation of leaders of color. I'm pleased that you specifically are engaging with this in this conference. And as I said, Danielle is a perfect person to work with you on this. I wish you well as you dialogue on these issues. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Howard, and welcome, Danielle.
Hello, and thank you so much. It does not matter how many times it happens. I still feel a little overwhelmed every time Howard Zare says my name. So forgive me if it takes me a second to regain my composure. He has long been a hero of mine and many others. And so it's an honor to be with all of you here today. I'm excited to share about our work at Common Justice, where we develop and advance solutions to violence that meet the needs of those harmed, advance racial equity, and don't rely on incarceration. This work starts from a belief in part that mass incarceration is a central moral challenge of our time, that no nation in human history has incarcerated as many of its own people as the United States does today. And it is my belief that the question of the spirit and soul of America depends on how we answer the question of whether we will continue to allow this practice of mass caging to define who we are and how we respond to harm. But I also know that not only will we not end mass incarceration without addressing violence, because violence comprises so many of the people who are incarcerated, we also will not end violence without ending mass incarceration. And so a lot for the basis of my comments today, I want to talk in part about how at Common Justice we think about responses to violence. We do that in a framework that is rooted in restorative and transformative justice. So you will hear that throughout. And our framework is also rooted in our core obligation to securing the safety of those who have been harmed and those who could be harmed were we not great at what we do. At the core of our practice in Common Justice, we run an alternative to incarceration for serious and violent crimes like stabbings, shootings, gunpoint robberies, where with the consent of the district attorney and the victims of those crimes, the people responsible for that harm go through an intensive violence intervention program over about 1.5 years. Partway through, they sit with those they've harmed, where they acknowledge the impact and reach agreements about how to make things as right as possible. If they complete those agreements and complete the program, they don't go to prison, and the felony charges against them are dismissed. And in the meantime, we work with the people whom they hurt to help them come through what happened to them and in their lives generally. Our work is fundamentally about figuring out a road to ending violence in our nation that has for so long been defined by it. We believe that 4 pillars should guide all of our responses to violence. The first is that we believe responses to violence should be survivor-centered. This sounds obvious. We talk as though we are survivor-centered. We name laws in survivors' names. We talk about survivors on the news. But the thing we rarely do is to actually listen to crime survivors. So I said at the top that we only take cases into common justice if the victims of those crimes agree. It's important to note that fewer than half of victims call the police in the first place, fewer than half. So that means any pretense that we are a victim-centered criminal justice system is baseless. Like, we're starting at 50%. When I was in school, that was an F. And then we go down from there. Of those half who call, another half won't make it past grand jury, the sort of first stage in that mechanical process the courts offer. And so that remaining 25% are arguably the jailingest subset of victims you'll find. They are the people who are pursuing a process likely to result in the incarceration of those who hurt them. And those are the people we ask, do you want common justice or do you want to see the person incarcerated? And 90% choose common justice, 90%. It's a wild number. When I first started seeing that number more than a decade ago in our work, I thought that we humans were better than I knew, that we were more forgiving, that we were more merciful, that we thought, but for the grace of God, go I. I think that was true in some of the cases, but I think something else was happening in most of them. And it was something I should have known as a survivor myself. So as a survivor, I know that we survivors will feel loss so profound that we would like wring out our bones to rid it from the marrow there. We feel fear so intrusive and all-consuming that in the safety of our own homes, in the arms of the people we trust and love most, we will be unable to sleep. And when exhaustion finally takes us, we will wake from that sleep with nightmares. We feel rage so intense that it makes us unrecognizable, not just to those who love us, but even to ourselves. But at the end of the day, there is something that characterizes almost all of us, which is that we are pragmatic. At the end of the day, there are 2 things that survivors can't abide. We cannot abide the idea of going through it again, and we cannot abide the idea of someone else going through what we went through. Which means when we are faced with options, we will choose the option that we believe will prevent that thing that we cannot stand. The hardest people to persuade that prison will deliver that are people who live in neighborhoods where incarceration is common. They have paid the price of prison's failure with their ongoing pain. And so our survivors, when they choose us, sometimes choose out of mercy, sometimes choose out of forgiveness, but almost always choose out of pragmatism. I think about one mother we worked with early in the program whose 14-year-old son was seriously hurt. And we were talking about whether the young man who hurt him would be incarcerated or in common justice. He was facing 3 years at the time. It had been negotiated down from 15. And the mother said to me, you know, when this first happened, first I wanted him to drown to death. And then I wanted him to burn to death. And then I realized as a mother, I don't want either of those things. I want him to drown in a river of fire so I don't have to choose. And she said, but 3 years from now, my 9-year-old son will be 12. And he'll be going to and from the corner store and to and from his aunt's house and to and from school alone. And one day he will walk by that young man. And on that day, I have to answer, do I want that young man to have been upstate or do I want him to have been with y'all? And she said, now the truth is if he were before me today and I had my machete, I would chop him to bits and bury him under my house and feel safe for the first time since he dare lay his hand on my baby. But the truth is I would rather him be with you all. Now, I don't know that it is a mother's obligation to prioritize the public safety over her rage and pain on behalf of her child. As the mother of an 18-month-old now, I cannot imagine laying down that rage, cannot imagine laying it down. I do think it is our responsibility as a society to do that, though. It is our responsibility to choose the thing that works, to choose the thing that delivers safety and justice, not only the thing that satisfies some part of us that aches for revenge. I also know that I believe it is our obligation as a society to do the things that will deliver healing. And what we know is that incarceration of someone who has caused harm doesn't ever do it. It's as though our criminal justice system, the best way I've been able to say it is that, like, if somebody burned down your house, all the criminal justice system can do is burn down their house in your name. What we want as survivors is somewhere to live. And we believe solutions to violence should provide just that. The second pillar that guides our work is that we believe solutions to violence should be accountability based. This also sounds obvious. We talk about accountability all the time, but usually in our nation, when we say accountability, we mean it as a synonym for punishment. And not only do I believe they are not the same, I believe they are often antithetical. Punishment is passive. Punishment is something somebody does to me. All I have to do to be punished is not escape it. Accountability is different. Accountability requires that I acknowledge what I've done, that I acknowledge its impact, that I express genuine remorse, that I make things as right as possible, ideally in a way defined by those I have hurt, and that I engage in the extraordinary labor of becoming somebody who will not cause that harm ever again. Accountability is some of the hardest work any of us will ever do. It is rooted in our human dignity. It requires our human agency. It is why it is so difficult to do in prison, is a place that both diminishes dignity and diminishes agency. But it is the thing that transforms us. It is the thing that turns us into somebody who will not cause that harm again. And I think often about a young man early in our time in Common Justice who had been gang involved since he was 8 years old. He had caused more harm than anyone should. He had survived more harm than anyone should. He had seen more harm than anyone should in a lifetime, let alone in his brief 19 years before we met him. And he sat one day in the circle with the young man he hurt, and with that young man's mother, and faced the pain that he had caused them, and sat through the process of reckoning with it, of reaching agreements of how to repair it. The circle went for hours and hours, and when it was finally gone and everyone was going home, he asked me if he could sit in my office for a while before he left. It was late at night, and so I said, "May I ask why?" And he said, "Well, I just don't want to go outside until my hand stops shaking." This is a young man who I'm sure could hold a gun steady as day. And he said, "Can I ask you, for all the harm I've done, for everything I've been through, I don't know if I've ever heard a real apology before. Do you think I did all right?" And because it was true, I said, "Yes, I think you did great." And he said, "Pardon my language, but that's the scariest shit I've ever done." Right? And he knew there was something in the human process of facing the hurt he had caused, of facing those impacted by his actions, that was harder than any of the violence he sustained, any of the times he had been locked up for brief and fairly long times, any of the times he himself had looked down the barrel of a gun. But looking into the mirror, looking into the eyes of those we have hurt, is one of the most demanding things that can be asked of us as human beings. And accountability asks that of us in ways prison never will. And in that way, for all its degradation, for all its brutality, there is a way that prison is actually very soft on crime, in the only way that actually matters, which is the part where we face the impact of what we've done and engage in making it right. The third principle that we believe should guide our responses to violence is that we think responses to violence should be safety driven. This seems obvious. You would think we'd want responses to violence to reduce violence, but it's not what we do. And so as people in the business of ending violence at Common Justice, we know that the core drivers of violence are structural. The drivers of violence are inequity. They are lack of access to schools, lack of access to medical care, lack of access to safe housing, all of those things. But on an individual level, the core drivers of violence are shame, isolation, exposure to violence, and an inability to meet one's economic needs. The core features of prison are shame, isolation, exposure to violence, and an inability to meet one's economic needs. This means we have baked into our core responses to violence precisely the things that generate it. It's like showing up at a house fire with a tank full of gasoline. Like we cannot act surprised when the flames rise higher. The thing that we know is that the way we produce safety is by counteracting those drivers of violence. And we know that safety is produced in relationship. And so I would invite everyone to take a moment. We'll take like 30 seconds in silence and invite you to think about a time that you felt safe. It can be brief. Not all of us have had long periods in our lives where we felt safe. It can be momentary, but think about where you were, who you were with, how it felt, how it smelled, how it sounded. Take 30 seconds to think of what that place is. And if it comes to you and if you're comfortable and want to say something in the chat about what you thought of, even if it's a word or two, please feel free to drop it there. Where is somewhere that you felt safe? I see Grandma and Grandpa's house. I see my parents' porch, connected, my childhood home, in nature, near water. At 16, in my mother's arms, at home, on the couch with my father, in God's arms, with my husband, right here, right now, with my parents, at a monastery retreat out on sunny beach, my husband's arms, at church, near trees, my son's home, on and on. And however long this conversation goes, what will not show up in this chat, I do not believe, because anywhere we have asked this question, what will not show up is in the presence of police or in the presence of prison. So when we know that safety is in relationship, that it is when we are with those we love, when we are rooted in our faith, when we are rooted in our values, in our truth, in our relationships, in our connection, in our place, then why, when we talk about public safety, are the first things we think about police and prisons, right? The thing that connects us are the things that keep us safe. Our values, our relationships, the best reasons we have for not hurting others are not because we would get caught, but because of our own conscience, because of the things in our lives we would not want to lose, because of the people we love who help keep us clear and focused. It is those things in the social fabric, in the fabric of our lives, that keep us safe. And it is that fabric that prison rips at so decisively every single time, as something that even at its least brutal is fundamentally made of isolation. The last thing we believe should characterize our responses to violence are that they should be racially equitable. Our responses to violence in this country never have been, never. And so when we say this, we are not talking about a tweak to a system. We are not talking to going back to something that has since broken. We are talking about building something we have never built. We are talking about building a nation who regards its responsibility of protecting the Black and brown people who live here and who, as we heard earlier, have lived here far longer than any of us white folks. A nation that takes their protection and safety as seriously as it takes the protection and safety of white people here. The criminal justice system is rife with racial disparities. At every decision point, you see them amplify. At arrest, at arraignment, what plea deals are offered, what sentences are given, when someone is granted parole. Every single point we see those amplify. And that same thing holds true for crime survivors, who, if they are Black and brown people, are likelier to be asked follow-up questions about their stories, to be blamed for the harm they sustained, to be just trusted as credible messengers of their own experience. And unless we get at that root of the criminal justice system, unless we understand that it is the grandchild of genocide and slavery, and that we have to reckon with the reality that we have continued to nourish that continuity through various means, the most recent of which is this system, we will never fundamentally change it. I believe we owe something for the harm that system has caused, for the children it has ripped from their parents, for the people who have suffered violence and sexual violence and degradation and separation and starvation and despair and all of these things, because we have chosen to do that as a country. We have chosen it. And we have caused thousands, millions and millions of people extraordinary harm as a result. I believe that when we cause harm, we owe repair. And I don't actually believe the steps are very different than those we described above for individual acts of harm. I believe we have to acknowledge what we have done. I believe we have to acknowledge its impact. I believe we have to express genuine remorse. I believe we have to make things as right as possible, ideally in a way defined by those we've harmed. And I believe we have to become a nation that will never do this ever again. A reckoning isn't an easy thing to choose. And those of us in restorative justice, even Howard Zare doesn't know everything about how to do that. But there is something that we do know, like every time we have a circle at Common Justice, the responsible party is nervous, doesn't usually want to come. The train seems to always be delayed on a circle day. They make up excuses, they are late, they are trembling, they are afraid. They drag themselves into that room, or we drag them lovingly. And every single time in those processes, every time, not only do people reach some clarity, not only do they reach agreements that they have done in 100% of common justice cases, even our attempted murders, even our shootings, 100%. But more than that, there is something that becomes possible on the other side of the truth that is not visible on this side of it. There is a way of being with each other. There is a way of seeing kind of past the horizon that was the closest one before to the next. Like there is a way of being in humanity with each other's humanity that not only wasn't available before we told the truth, but wasn't even possible. And so I believe as a nation, it is our time to tell the truth. I believe we have gotten as much change as we can get on this side of that stark and courageous honesty. I believe there is nothing left for us but to walk through that wall of fire to the other side. And I do not pretend that it would be easy. It is not easy. I don't pretend that part of us isn't wrong for wanting to avoid it, for the difficulty it will require. But I do believe, and I think we see this in this moment in our nation more viscerally than perhaps ever in most of our lifetimes, that there is nothing on this side of the truth but death. And so whatever our future is, it is on the other side of that reckoning. And as somebody who has seen people rise to the challenge of reckoning over and over again, I offer to you like my unequivocal faith that it will be worth it, and that the world we stand to become on the other side is the one that we actually all deserve. And so with that, I'll stop and open the conversation to all of us together. Thank you.
Thank you, Danielle. Please, let's offer Danielle just a virtual round of applause. Thank you so much for sharing your insights, your wisdom, and your faith with us today. Before we move into question and answer, we have plenty of time to just pick Danielle's brain and get some insight from her. But before offering those questions, just hold them for a moment. We're going to invite you into a reflective exercise as we prepare for some Q&A. This exercise is called Chatterfall, and it is an opportunity for you to dig deep, have a little fun, and share your quick responses to certain prompts. So using the chat feature, I'll ask that you respond to a prompt, but do not click the enter or return button just yet, because I'll cue you all at the same time to click that return button to share and allow a falling of chats to that particular prompt. Now, it'll be a little overwhelming. There are 300 of us here today, but then peruse through those chats, get the essence of those chats to see where we are collectively at. So our first prompt into the chat without clicking the return button, just type, "My body is telling me." Where are you at right now? How is your body, the somatic sense, feeling in this moment? And on the count of 3, I'll have you click that enter. So hold on for just a moment. And it's okay if you jump the gun on that. But on the count of 3, let's click that return button to "My body is telling me." 1, 2, and 3. Wonderful. And just kind of get that essence of what folks are sharing, where they're at. I see breathe and healing, stretching, alert and rested, in pain, heavy. Thank you. And so many more that I couldn't possibly say. Thank you. For our next prompt, something challenging me. Something that's challenging me. Again, just hold your answer or response for just a moment. Don't overthink it. Something that's challenging me. And on the count of 3, click that return button. 1, 2, and 3. Something that's challenged me. Take a look at what your fellow conference participants are sharing. We see racism and loneliness, hurt, overwhelming, love, the deep work of restorative justice, to name only a few. And a final prompt before we move into our Q&A. Something I want to hear more about. And don't click that return button just yet, but something I want to hear more about. And on the count of 3, click that return button. 1, 2, and 3. What is it you want to hear more about? Examples of success, how to begin, about prison abolition, action, individual justice. Take a look at what folks are saying. Where are we at as a group? So at this moment, Danielle, I want to bring you back into the conversation, and all of you, we have quite a few minutes left with Danielle, about 10 or 15. If you have a question, go ahead and offer it in the chat box. I'll do my best to feed those to Danielle for a response. We're going to invite your questions at this moment. Danielle, as we're waiting for some of those coming in, could you just help repeat for all of us those 4 things that cause violence, just so everybody can capture that?
Sure. And the things we think cause violence on the individual level are shame, isolation, exposure to violence, and an inability to meet one's economic needs, which we see also as the core defining features of imprisonment.
Thank you. We have a question from Corky, I believe, if I can expand on. I think it's a discussion of prison normalization and where is it at in the United States.
And what do you mean by prison normalization? Can you say more?
I believe there was a previous chat, if I have to guess, but Corky, please let us know. There was some interest in understanding models of prison outside of the United States and innovative ways of thinking about prison that might be happening inside the United States.
So I can answer this question, and I'm exactly the wrong person to answer it. So I can answer it in saying, like, there are models internationally where prisons are not primarily defined by degradation. So they're defined by separation and isolation, but not by the dehumanization of the people who are there. Germany and Norway in particular have prisons that have those characteristics. I think part of what's compelling about the prison system in Germany is that if you ask people how they got to that, they talk all the time about it being rooted in their own reckoning with the Holocaust and the harm they caused nationally, and understanding a continuity between that kind of harm and what they do to the people in their society who they deem as people who have broken laws or who have to be punished in some way, and being really disciplined about ensuring that everybody's humanity is present in every action that the society or government takes. The reason I'm a bad person to answer this question is that I believe that for virtually everybody, in virtually every circumstance, that we can get to a point that we can hold people in ways other than incarceration. I believe, first of all, that Like on the day I was born, there were 443,850 people locked up in the US. There are 2.3 million today. But that means that getting to shrinking so far as to 443,000 doesn't actually require us to be visionary, doesn't require us to be wildly imaginative. It requires us to remember the late 70s. And some of us can help us do that. And so I say that to say that our prisons didn't grow because there was more violence or more harm. Our prisons grew because of policy decisions that we've made and can unmake. And so I think it's very important that we not fall into the trap that seeing our way out of this as a defining feature of our culture requires something so extraordinary that it may not be within our reach. We can, in the very near term, make choices like those that we made previously that will dramatically shrink our use of incarceration. And while we are doing that, do the visionary work that will push us even farther.
Thank you, Danielle. I see a question here about what challenges does funding common justice encounter, and how, if at all, is this being impacted by the current COVID economy?
We've been really fortunate in terms of funding. And at the same time, certainly COVID makes everything harder. Resources are more constrained and more stretched. We are all struggling with the question of, do we invest in big policy change or in meeting people's most urgent material needs in the moment? I think governments are challenged by that question. Foundations are. I think individuals who have $100 to give every month are challenged by that question and where we put our resources. And that certainly impacts us. I think one of the things we have to do as a country is to really think about our budgets as moral documents, as a way of reflecting the things that are most important to us. So to think about the $80 billion a year we spend on prisons and ask ourselves, if you were to convene a group of mothers who had buried their children, and you told them they had $80 billion to ensure no other mother would have to endure that pain, do you think this is the answer they would give? Having talked to hundreds of mothers who have borne that kind of loss, not one of them has said that the thing that they wished had happened more, that would have kept their child safe, would have been more incarceration or more police. They say the same things that other survivors say, the same things that incarcerated people say, which is that we would have invested in schools, we would have invested in hospitals, we would have invested in universal access to safe housing, to medical care, to all of those things, and that those investments would have kept us safe. And so I think part of our challenge is when we look to sustain these programs through philanthropy primarily, or through a tiny sliver of how our government spends resources on these little grants to nonprofits, it's extremely difficult to sustain enough programs that could grow to the scale that we need if we consider the pot of resources to be our truly collectively available resources. Then we have more than we need to do this in the way it needs to be done.
Thank you. I see another question regarding persuading judges or maybe other stakeholders about the use of restorative justice, not only in minor crimes, but in more serious and violent crimes.
I find the hardest people to persuade are people relatively new to the job. The brand new prosecutors are sometimes excited. The people who've been there 5 years are the hardest. The people who've been there 10 years, 15 years, 20 years have had the experience of prosecuting the same person 5 times, 10 times, 15 times in a row. They had their slam dunk case, their second year as an ADA that they were so proud of, and they got a 10-year sentence, and 10 and a half years later, they see that same person before the court again. Judges see the same people over and over again. They see the same survivors experience different kinds of harm, where even if they secured a punishment for one, it did not protect the survivor from the next thing. And so I think the thing that has worked for us with prosecutors and judges is to really say, what are you here to do? If what they're here to do is to secure the greatest possible number of convictions for the longest possible term, we're not going to get very far. If what they are here to do is to ensure safety and secure justice, then they will be the first to tell you that the tools available to them in their toolbox are far too limited. that the thing that made them out of law school decide to go into public service instead of somewhere they could have made a lot more money, like their sense of civic responsibility, their sense of obligation to be part of some kind of good, that most days they do not feel that they can achieve it. I did a continuing legal education thing for a bunch of judges, and I asked them, I was like, how many of you would say that in a given day, the decisions that you made were fair and were likely to result in a good outcome for everybody involved? Raise your hand if that was 90% of your decisions. Nobody. 80, nobody. 70, 60, 50, one hand. 40, one hand. 30, two hands. 20, another couple hands. 10% or less, almost all the hands in the room, right? So they know. They're like, I have some decisions I think were fair, but will not actually result in a good outcome for at least one of the parties, or decisions that might result in a good outcome, but fundamentally weren't fair. Like, they know that the tools available to them are inconsistent, even with their own values and their own aims. And so when they have other tools, they will move toward them. It matters to acknowledge with them the political realities they're facing. It helps them to understand the crime survivors will stand with them in the move toward applying this to violence. It helps them to understand that they can center crime victims as their core constituents and still choose this, not that they have to turn their backs on victims and face defendants in a liberatory posture, but rather that they actually have to turn to the full range of victims in their jurisdictions and listen to them truly. And that if they do that, they will be called upon to do it. So there's a lot of management of the politics. There's a lot of just the part of that that is not about morality or persuasion or vision, but is just the nitty gritty political reality in any jurisdiction. And then there is the part that is about letting people recenter in what brings them to the thing they do day in and day out, and to offer them a tool that lets them do their jobs and at the end of the day feel they did something of worth.
Thank you, Danielle. I've officially got more questions than we'll ever be able to answer, but I'm going to try and do my best to combine. And I think one that I find I would love to hear your response on. This person says, I've encountered people who deny that racism exists. I'm white, but I get frustrated and angry. I don't know how to respond in ways that are effective. I have been told to ask questions to get people to think, but my experience is that it doesn't help. Suggestions?
Yeah, I think as white people, very often, like the first stage of our development as anti-racist is that we sort of really come deeply to terms with the fact that we are not better than people of color. And then part of us, because we've been so trained in our internalized superiority, we are like, well, if we're not better than people of color, who are we better than? And we're like, I know, racist white people. Like, we still find a way to stand in a posture of superiority, even in our anti-racism. And I think the thing that we have to find a way to do, and it is hard at times, it is hard because of that teaching, and it is hard because we are faced with people who are talking hatefully about people we care about and love. But we have to stand beside people, not across from them. We have to stand closer and closer and closer to other white people instead of further and further away. We will not end racism by unfriending racist white people on Facebook. That is not how we're going to get there as a world. I'm like, I will bet everything I have that that will not get us there. And that what we do is that we hold one another close. And I do think questions are right, but I think those questions are also about, like, I think about with extended family I have who live in 99% white places and have a hard time seeing to racism, is to ask them things about, like, how people like themselves are portrayed on television, like how poor white folks are portrayed, how like trailer trash are portrayed, like how people whose circumstances are similar to theirs are reflected, and ask them if they think those reflections are honest and accurate and like capture the humanity of what they know about themselves and those they loved. And most everybody will say no. And then to be like, well, then, what is our basis to think that those portrayals of others are more accurate somehow than the portrayals of us? I think one of the things I will say, there are very few things I will credit our current president for. This is me as a person, not as a 501c3. But I will say that, to his credit, since 2016, I've heard far fewer people use the term post-racial. I think there is a way, this brilliant thinker, Adrienne Marie Brown, says, like, things are not getting worse, they are getting revealed. And the thing we have to do is hold each other close and continue to pull back the veil. And I think all of that is important. I think the fact that things are not necessarily worsening, that we are just seeing them more clearly, they're becoming more overt, they're rising to the surface. It's ugly, but it's more visible. And the thing is that visibility gives us an opportunity. Like, it gives us an opportunity for people who have not seen racism as real to have it come into focus in this moment of such division and such pain in our nation. And then I think the lesson, not just that we pull back the veil, but that we hold each other close as we do it. I think our challenge is to be like, if I am someone who is trying, then I am equal to anyone else who is trying, and to hold the white folks in our lives close to us, and to stand there with persistence and open hearts and rigor and love, and to refuse to have to choose between our love for them and our love for the people of color in our lives. To say, I will not be made to choose. Like, I know these things have to be able to coexist, and to continue to grapple until we are in a place that our love for the white people we know who harbor deeply racist views, our love for ourselves, and our love for people of color are not mutually exclusive. And so I don't think it's easy. I think it's a long labor, but I do think it's most centrally a labor of love.
Thank you, Danielle. There are several questions really related to the expansion, or perhaps its replication, of the type of work happening at Common Justice. Do you have thoughts or advice on the replication or building restorative justice work in counties, communities, churches, schools? Thoughts there?
Yeah, I would say I think one of the most important first steps is to begin to gather crime survivors, like to begin to gather people who have been hurt by harm, including people who didn't call the police, including people who went through the criminal justice system and were dissatisfied, including the people who are not typically standing on the stages or portrayed in the pictures of crime survivors. Like, I know, for example, that a young man of color is 10.5 times more likely than I am to be robbed or assaulted. And I am 1,000 times more likely to see my likeness in a poster about victim services, right? But I think one of the first things is to create spaces for people who have survived harm to gather and to talk about what they would have wanted, like to talk about what would have made them safe in the first place, what would have prevented the harm, and then after the harm, what would have brought them some measure of healing and safety and peace. And from that, to start to work with those people, like to organize with those people, to talk to their elected officials, to talk to their district attorneys, to form partnerships with community-based organizations that know a thing or two about restorative justice, but to build from that power, because so much of the criminal justice system's power is rooted in its claim that it speaks on behalf of victims. And I think the way that we displace that is to make sure that victims have the opportunity to speak on their own behalves. And that will include some victims who call for punishment, who call for blood, who call for a pound of flesh, but they will not be the majority. And it doesn't mean that their views are not meaningful. It doesn't mean their views are not legitimate. It does mean their views should not be treated as representative of some universal opinion when they're not. That we can make space for those as a small minority of what crime victims want, and a small but legitimate minority, but that is different than us treating it as though it reflects the majority that isn't there. So I said earlier that at the top of this, that 90% of people who are asked to choose between common justice and incarceration choose common justice. And once in a while, we'll ask people who say yes, what percentage of people do you think say yes? And almost all of them will say, I don't know, about 5%. So here they are as part of this vast majority, but experiencing themselves as outliers, experiencing themselves as somehow unusual or strange or different or separate from the whole. And so I think if our task was to change everyone's hearts and minds, I don't know if we could do that in a generation. Some generations, there is an opening, there's an acceleration. I think we may be that generation, and lucky us to be alive in that time. But even if we're not, Or I mean, even if we are, those things take a lot of time. But I don't actually think the majority of what is needed is changing hearts and minds. I think the vast majority of survivors already know that what has been made available to them is not what they need, is not what they deserve, is not what they want. And they feel that they are different in that. They feel they are separate in that. They feel they are isolated in that. And so what we have to do is not so much change everyone's hearts and minds as to reveal people to each other, to let people see themselves as part of the vast majority to which they belong. And when people understand themselves as part of a vast majority, they do what majorities do. They speak louder, they claim what is theirs, they demand to be treated with dignity and respect, and they win.
Wow. Thank you so much, Danielle. I can't think of a better way to just conclude the remarks than on that point of helping to reveal one another to each other. Thank you so much.
And thank you so much for opening this sacred space to me. I appreciate it so deeply.
You're very welcome. Let's offer Danielle one more virtual round of applause for her time and that she's and her gifts that she shared with us. I'd like to now, I'll turn it over to Caitlin to close us out.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Danielle. We know that it's a true honor to have you with us, and we will walk with these questions and invitations and challenges as we move throughout the day into the workshops and spaces to come. So before we give a little bit of an announcement reminder of what those spaces are, we wanted to share a couple of reminders of ways we can be engaging with one another. First of all, I wanted to quickly share a resource opportunity. We've heard quite a bit about Circle Process today, in addition to victim offender reconciliation. You know, Circle Process, just one of many restorative practices that we might turn to. At Catholic Mobilizing Network, we are offering Circle, what we're calling intensives, an experience with Circle Process, as well as training opportunities and finding ways to connect with training opportunities in your particular community. And so if that is something that you're interested in being a part of, our friends are dropping that interest form into the chat. Let us know and we'll be sure to let you know when we have more of those scheduled and opportunities you can take part in. A reminder to visit our exhibit hall. Again, you can click into the booths at any time. And particularly this afternoon after our workshops, you can talk live with a number of our exhibitors. That the exhibit hall will, the live space today is the last day for it. So be sure, don't miss it. If you haven't already ordered your complimentary copy of Harm, Healing, and Human Dignity, just a reminder that the Faith Formation Guide information is on the preparation page. And wanted to express one more reminder to update your user profile. Tell us if you're going to be coming to the virtual circles on Saturday afternoon. We want to make sure to plan accordingly. And we're asking for your response by 6 p.m. Central, 9 p.m. Eastern today. So thank you. All right, so following this session, starting at 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern, we have 6 dynamic workshops that you can choose from, followed by that exhibit hall and networking time. We hope that in addition to reaching out to our exhibitors, that you will reach out to your fellow participants as well and find time to connect outside of this conference time and space. Next, of course, don't miss our closing plenary sessions tonight. You have a choice between 2 amazing panels, one on living restoratively, one on restorative justice and law and legal practice. We hope that we will see each other all again then. And finally, tonight we have 2 fireside chats with very special conversation partners, Sister Helen Prejean and Father Greg Boyle, and we hope that you will join us then as well. So that's just a little bit of what's to come today. We are so grateful that you are with us and wish you a wonderful workshop experience and look forward to seeing you again soon.